USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Darna Noor from Earther and I are still working on pulling together another episode for our education series around what can be done about this problem of the fossil fuel industry infiltrating schools. In the meantime, I wanted to bring you the extended version of my interview with Ben Franta, the Stanford University researcher we heard from last time, who discovered how much fossil fuel interests were shaping our understanding of economics in this country. Ben got into a lot more detail about things that he has seen at the university level. I think you'll find it interesting. That conversation is coming up right after this quick break.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
It's summer. Time to enjoy long days, lazy nights, and great food. Because Uber Eats has deals all summer long. So, when hunger strikes, don't sweat it. Delicious deals are just a tap away on Uber Eats. Enjoy all your favorite grocery items delivered straight to you. Get ice cream, soda, and snacks from your favorite stores like Wegmans and CVS and make the most of every moment. Now that sounds like a good summer. Order now on Uber Eats. Terms apply. Product availability varies by region. See app for details.
This episode is supported by Degrees, real talk about planet-saving careers, an original podcast from the Environmental Defense Fund. People ask me all the time what they can do about climate change, and I feel a little bit like a climate change guidance counselor sometimes. The short answer is, what are you good at? What are you interested in? Where can you plug in? What I like about Degrees is that it helps people figure out how they could maybe use their job to make an impact. Degrees features candid conversations and takeaways from today's most inspiring climate change makers. Each episode tells a story of how one inspiring change maker found their climate career and how you can too. There's a new season out now, season 3, and it's all about how no matter the industry, you can find a planet-saving job. I got a sneak preview of season 3 of Degrees, and I loved it, especially the episode about Lake Street Drive, which is a green band, which is actually a lot harder to pull off than you might think, just in terms of all of the disposable things that come along with touring and concerts and music venues, trying to convince venues to reduce their waste, all of that stuff. Travel, how do you figure that out? It was really good. And there's lots more where that came from too. These narrative stories will capture your attention and inspire you while giving you practical tips on how to get a climate-focused career. Search for Degrees, real talk about planet-saving careers, anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll include a link in the show notes too. Big thanks to Degrees for their support. I was super interested to read your paper because actually Darna and I were just saying, wow, I was pulling together a list of, all of the things that either fossil fuel companies or, sort of foundations that have represented them or their interests are investing in at universities. And there's so many of these economics research chairs and economic centers and whatever that I was like, I feel like we need to like, dig into the ways that they're trying to shape people's understanding of the economy and how it works. And then I found actually in the Newsom archives this insane like cross-industry strategy with like confidential stamps all over it that was like as World War II was about to end, all of these, it was like Standard Oil, GM, General Electric, I can't remember what the other ones were, but they were all freaking out, maybe Ford, about not that, they were going to have a decline in sales because the government wasn't buying stuff from them anymore. They were worried that Americans, because the government had done such a good job of running everything during World War II, that Americans would turn away from the idea of free enterprise.
Oh.
And they were like, this is the number one problem facing every industry, like all hands on deck.
So
super interesting. Yeah.
The problem was that the government was too competent, basically. And they didn't like how that looked.
Yes. That's it.
So interesting.
They were like, Americans might have actually really enjoyed this competent government over the last few years.
I think it's only a matter of time before the more you learn, the more you start to suspect that corporations have controlled your entire perception of reality.
Yes!
From like the moment you were born.
Yes!
You're like, oh my God, what is even real?
It is so disturbing. I also you just see so many of the talking points that you still see today, kind of being, I don't know, being dreamt up and sent out back then.
Well, it's so, the PR techniques, they're so smart in going like one or more steps above the level of just the thing they're trying to sell.
That's right.
In terms of awareness. That's right. And
yes.
Like my favorite.
Yeah, it's like they shape the context, right?
Yeah. It's sort of like, don't sell water, put people in a desert.
Right.
Right? I think my favorite example was in that propaganda book, Bernays talks about when he worked for like the piano industry. And he's, instead of putting ads for pianos into like magazines, he was like, I went to architecture magazines and got them to highlight and talk about these celebrities' homes that had a music room in them.
Wow.
Or a piano room in them. And then that became like defined as like the American dream, sort of like you needed to have a music room, you need to have a piano room. And then it was like people would buy houses with a piano room. They didn't know how to play the piano, but they were like, now we need to get a piano for the piano room. But they never even had to advertise pianos.
Yeah.
Like it was like, what? Yeah. Like it's just so
crazy.
Smart.
It's so smart. I can't remember where I read this, if it was there or somewhere else. The watch example, the like pocket watches and wrist watches.
Ooh, I'm not sure.
Okay. This watch manufacturer came to him and to help them, like they wanted to see if they could break down the gender taboo about men wearing wristwatches, because apparently at the time it was like if you wore a wristwatch, you were gay. Like only women wore wristwatches and like real men had pocket watches and whatever. And so he commissioned a report. Who knows if it was like even valid, but he commissioned a report like that U.S. soldiers were, well, first he was like, who's the most manly man?
Yeah.
Soldiers. And then he was like, okay, U.S. soldiers are getting picked off in the trenches when they light a match to look at their pocket watch. And so he convinced the army to make wristwatches standard issue.
Yeah.
And there you go. It became like a masculine accessory. Just like this guy was so smart.
Yeah.
He was very much, he knew he was smart and like really liked being smarter than everybody else too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, it's kind of a godlike
Yeah.
sort of feeling probably to think that you're shaping people's like fundamental perceptions about, you know, what's cool, what's not cool, what's masculine, what's good, all of that stuff, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they're making decisions that they think are their own.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, about, like silly things like what kind of watch you're going to have, but then also about really big things. I mean, that's the thing that I find so interesting too, is it's sort of like the same techniques, whether they're trying to sell watches or, policy. So I was hoping to get you talking about, I think I have you telling me this story a long time ago on really bad phone tape, but when you were at Harvard and you realized that the Harvard Kennedy School had a lot of fossil fuel funding, and I think it was you that said that someone didn't want students to talk to reporters about having that funding.
Yeah. So now you're getting into the juicy details.
Mm-hmm.
This is back, yeah.
Spill the dirt.
Spill the
Spill it.
beans.
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Yeah, so this was back when I was a grad student at Harvard, and I was working at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's in the Kennedy School of Government. The role of fossil fuel companies in academia had started to become a bigger issue. And this was around probably like 2015 or so. For instance, I think, when the journalism school at Columbia came out with the Exxon New investigation, or they started doing some work related to that. Then Exxon responded by kind of threatening to take away their funding in so many words. And it just, people became more and more interested in, who's funding these programs at universities, and is it fossil fuel companies, and what kind of pressure does that put on those academic programs to do one thing or another, or study one thing or another, or not to study something. And I started to look into this issue at Harvard, looking at what programs are funded by oil companies.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the programs at the Kennedy School, the government school, to do with public policy, were funded, and as far as I know, they still are funded by big oil companies. For example, I worked at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. It's one of the most influential academic think tanks in the world. And the founder of that founded an oil and gas company. That's how he made his fortune to begin with. The environmental economics program at Harvard, funded by oil companies, and so on. So it's not just that public policy schools are being funded by oil companies sometimes. It's that the programs that are focused on climate or environment or sustainability in particular, those are often funded by the oil companies. Now, so back to 2015. So this issue is starting to emerge. I'm starting to write about it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it was seen as a very unpopular thing to do.
Yes,
I
remember this. Yes, yeah. I remember you had quite a like Twitter kerfuffle happen about this stuff, right?
Oh yes, and that was even years later. I mean, that was only a few years ago, and at this early stage, it was seen as just really uncouth to raise this issue. And I even had professors at the Kennedy School who just wouldn't talk to me, I think because they were upset that I was writing about the issue. But anyway, to get to the main point, once we were called into an all-staff meeting for the researchers at the Kennedy School and the Belfer Center, and we were simply instructed that, if any journalists come to talk to us about, oil companies funding the research done there, just don't talk to them.
Wow.
Don't talk to the journalists. We don't want, we were told that we don't want activists. We don't want journalists digging around and finding out that the programs are being funded by oil companies.
Hmm.
And I mean, when I heard this, I was pretty surprised that level of secrecy was being pursued. I mean, at that time, I was mostly working in physics because that's what my PhD was in, applied physics. And, often we would get funded from all sorts of places, including like Department of Defense, sources that, not everybody would think are great.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, we always advertised and disclosed who was funding our research. And we were generally proud of it, but we definitely didn't keep it a secret.
Right.
And so, encountering this secrecy in the public policy space, I just thought that was so strange. And of course, for me, when they said, don't don't talk about this thing, I wanted to talk about it more. Like my ears perked up and I was like, I was, probably dozing off in the back or something. And I like my, I popped up alert and I was like, oh, that's something interesting is going on. So yeah, but I think it speaks to the broader issue, which is to what degree has the fossil fuel industry shaped the very public policy responses and paradigms and ways of thinking about climate change as a problem? How has the industry shaped those things at the basic level, at the level of students learning about them in universities?
Right.
And it's these questions, as we were just talking about, Bernays and other masters of the craft of public perception, they're not just shaped by, the final answer that you get when you're analyzing a problem. It's shaped by how do you even think about the problem in the first place?
Right.
What's the paradigm through which you are seeing a problem, defining it, and that's the level, that's the sort of all-encompassing scale where that's relevant for when people are learning about these issues in universities, among other scales, but that's a really important one. So, I think to me, that just speaks to that broader issue. And of course, I think since then, finally now today, there's more and more awareness that yes, especially big oil companies have been very present in these elite, very influential academic programs in the social sciences, in the policy arena. And the question that's obvious that we should ask is, what effect has that had?
Right.
What has been the influence of decades of funding from these special interests? Obviously, there's a conflict of interest when these programs are meant to defend society against the problems that these companies are creating. And yet these programs are dependent on those companies to exist. So it's a big issue. And I think the time, it's more than ripe to address it.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the other places that you have seen this come up? I know that there's kind of oil funding at every big university you can think of, but are there other, I guess, public policy or economics examples that you've found that were surprising?
Yeah. So, this latest research is one example. Some new research that will be out soon, and by the time this airs, it might already be out.
Yeah.
It tracks the activity of a group of economic consultants who were hired by the petroleum industry for decades to produce analyses that were then used by the companies and by others opposing restrictions on fossil fuels to tell the public that it would just be way too expensive to act on climate. And that in any case, climate was not going to be a big deal. So the best thing to do was just do nothing. And this was the economic ammunition that the industry used alongside their scientific merchants of doubt. And so if you look back into the newspaper record and, the record of communication from the oil companies, they often employed this two-pronged strategy of using the scientific merchants of doubt to cast doubt on the science itself. And by them, I mean the people like Naomi Oreskes and other historians, Eric Conway and other historians have documented, and their think tanks like the George Marshall Institute and so on. Mm-hmm. That's the scientific side, to litigate the science. Then on the economic side, you have the economists hired by the petroleum industry often to say it's just way too expensive to do anything. And so that's this other side that has not been examined as much. And it's really, it has been allowed to survive, I think, because it hasn't been examined. It's sort of flown under the radar.
Yeah.
And, when I first noticed this, I was really shocked, because I first noticed this probably around maybe 3 years ago. And I was doing, academic research. One thing I do in my historical research is I'll download like the entire online newspaper record. For example, I study the American Petroleum Institute. And so I'll download every newspaper article on an online database with the words American Petroleum Institute and global warming or climate change in their record. That might be, a few thousand articles, and I'll sort them in chronological order, and I'll read all of them just to get the story, just to see, what are their phases of communication? What are the battles they're fighting at different times? And I was doing that over, it takes many days to read that much material, but I was doing that, and I noticed that, there are these economists that keep coming up again and again.
Wow.
And I was like, that's interesting. And this, this was stuff from like the early to mid 1990s. Mm-hmm. So this is a while ago. I thought, oh, I'm sure they're not, doing stuff anymore. Then at the same time I was doing this research, President Trump announced that the U.S. was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. And in his speech, I think this was in 2017, he said that the Paris Agreement was going to cost, an American family, $4,000 per year or something like that. It's going to cost a lot of money. And I thought, this doesn't really make sense, because those parts of the Paris Agreement are not legally binding to begin with. I thought, who are the economists that are saying this? Where's this analysis coming from to give President Trump the talking points, to say that in a speech? And I looked up the economic analysis that President Trump used, and it was the same people. It was the same economists that I had noticed were working on on these things in like the mid 90s, giving the same talking points against the Kyoto Protocol in 1997.
God damn it! I swear, the Groundhog Day-ness of all of that is so infuriating. It's just, wow, we're right back at the same place again, and the same thing is happening, and we still don't actually know how it happened the first time.
I know.
And yet people, I think, I find this all the time, that people are like, okay, yeah, we know. What are you going to work on next? And I'm like, I don't think we do know, actually. Mm-hmm. I don't think we know. I think we've just scratched the surface.
Oh, yeah.
Of what happened then.
I agree. What we have so far, I think, is just a faint trace of what occurred. And I mean, there's much more. I mean, at least I feel like we're continuing to find important material, important records that reshape our understanding of what has happened, and doesn't seem to be close to getting to that to the end of it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And people forget. It's, in the 90s, there were some enterprising journalists who did notice the industry's influence.
Right.
at the time.
Right.
And they're heroes. They were saying things that nobody else was saying. They were seeing things no one else was seeing. And, unfortunately, just not enough people listened to them at the time. So some people noticed, but not enough people noticed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just because one person noticed something at one time doesn't mean that everybody knows this very important fact.
Did you look into the National Bureau of Economic Research?
I haven't really.
Oh my God. Ben, I just started looking into them, and ExxonMobil is a funder of them now. And the Bradley Foundation has funded them forever. Like, they had donations for a long time from Scaife and Olin, all the usual suspects. But I'm looking back now through the Wayback Machine to see exactly when Exxon came on. Mm-hmm. So I can see like what exactly their influence has been, because it's crazy. It's like those guys are like, the president of the NBER is like the main, I don't know, he's in charge of the economics program at MIT. The like vice president is like runs the economics department at Harvard. It's like every economics department at every major university is run by someone who's part of the NBER, which sounds and acts like it's some kind of neutral, or maybe government entity, but is not at all. Yeah. and I'm just like, oh my gosh, these guys have been influencing like how people think about economics, since the 20s. And they've been, funded by sort of titans of industry all along.
Yeah, it's like, how far back do you want to go? I mean, the development of neoclassical economics, which basically asserted that, the economy left to its own devices would spontaneously find, an equilibrium that was optimal or natural, at least.
Magic. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways that was formulated as a scientific defense against Marxism.
Right.
So it's like, how far back do you want to go in terms of, special interests, moneyed interests, vested interests, corporate interests often, trying to cultivate certain scientific ideas for political advantage, and it goes back, at least that far, and it's never stopped.
Really, like what you see is the PR industry comes about right after the very, very first regulation is passed on any industry in the US, on the railroads in the late 1800s. And right when people who don't look like the people who are running all these companies start to get the vote. And like, it is a tool to circumvent democracy, and it's, I don't know, I'm just, even with the economists, what's his face? Ivy Lee created the Bureau of Railroad Economics for the railroads. And all those economists were portrayed as being totally independent. Nobody knew that thing was created by a PR firm and funded by the industry. And those economists got quoted in every newspaper all the time about the economic implications of various policies around the railroads. And that was like, what, 1890? 1897 maybe. So yeah, I don't know.
Totally. Yeah. And so many of those strategies are dependent on not being seen, not being identified. Yes. That's sort of the whole the whole idea behind like any third party technique is to conceal the messenger, of course. And, that's why it's so effective, often simply revealing what's going on. I know that's not always sufficient, but it can be hugely impactful just to be able to see, to recognize something.
Yes.
That's why when I saw, what was happening with President Trump in the Paris Agreement, and he was using the same talking points, I thought it was worth pointing out that, look, we have seen this before. This isn't new.
Right.
This is the same exact strategy, same talking points, even the same people, that used this strategy back in mid 90s, the 2000s to fight the cap and trade, domestic US legislation proposals, all of these proposals for decades. It's the same thing. So, at least if we can come to recognize it for what it is, hopefully, some of its obstructing power can be taken away.
Can you tell us who this economist or these economists were and a little bit about them?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a small group of them, at least the group that I looked at. The main one, his name is David Montgomery.
Mhm.
And, he was a well-respected economist. Before the 90s, he'd worked in the Ford administration, the Carter administration, the George H.W. Bush 1 administration. He worked in the Energy Information Administration. So he had a lot of credentials.
Mhm.
And starting in the early 90s, around 1991 or so, the petroleum industry hired him to estimate how much it would cost to put regulations on fossil fuels to deal with climate change.
Mhm.
So I mean, I think the first lesson of this history is that governments they tried to act,
Mhm.
that early on, and that's when this sort of obstruction game really came to force. Three decades ago, essentially,
Mhm.
and so basically he'd come out with an analysis that would say, oh, if you want to reduce CO2 emissions, it's going to cost, all this money, hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2. And that's going to, cost all these jobs,
Right.
reduce GDP and so on. And generally he would say it's going to be really expensive
Mhm.
and climate change is not really going to be that bad. So he had kind of two parts to it, and they were both misleading in a sense, at least, because on the cost side, his models were inflating the costs based on the modeling approach. And on the benefit side, as in global warming avoided, he didn't even address that. There was zero analysis. It was simply an assertion like global warming is not really going to be that bad. I think at one point he said, if anything, it'll cost 0.5% of gross national product in the year 2100, which
Mhm.
is like, it's like, okay, 110 years from now, you can predict that with zero analysis. Okay. But,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and then he's look at the comparison. Action costs a lot. Inaction doesn't cost much.
Right.
You do the math. And so the point was don't do anything and wait. And, eventually he was joined by other colleagues. They worked at different economic consulting firms. And
Mm.
one of the main one they worked at over this period of time was called Charles River Associates, which
Mhm.
still exists. I mean, it's still a major consulting firm.
Mhm.
And but they've moved around. I think that the analysis that Trump used to lead the Paris Agreement, that was done by NERA Economic Consulting, different,
Mhm.
and so they sort of moved around, but it was the same story again and again. 1993, the Clinton administration tried to put out what eventually was called the BTU tax, but that was this hybrid energy and carbon. It was like an energy tax that was heavier if you were carbon intensive.
Mhm.
And, same strategy. The industry litigated the science, brought out their merchants of doubt, said climate science was unproven, then
Mhm.
brought out their economists, the same group of people who said, oh, it's going to be really, really expensive. Kyoto
Mhm.
Protocol, because domestic policies were failing, clearly.
Right.
So
Right.
governments moved to the international approach through the UN process. Kyoto Protocol comes out. Again, exact same strategy.
Mm.
Now, of course, Kyoto Protocol was, adopted, but it was not ratified by the United States, of course. And the
Mhm.
United States left that with George Bush too in the
Mhm.
early 2000s. And again, is the same strategy. It's that this is going to be economically disastrous, and the science is still uncertain.
Mhm.
And it's the exact same strategy. Then now that failed, it was back to the domestic approach again. So that's when we had this series of cap and trade bills in the Senate and the House, like Waxman-Markey and so on.
Right.
And again, it was, every time there was a major climate policy proposal, it's like these same guys would just appear again. And, generally they were, being commissioned by the American Petroleum Institute or other industry groups. And, it was the same analysis. They were just, turning the crank essentially again and again. And, so it's this parallel sort of this whole shaping of economics. And eventually their analyses became conventional wisdom. I mean, by 2010 or so, they'd been at this for 20 years. And, senators were saying, look, it's like, we don't even need a study because we know that they've already been saying this for 20 years. And so in a way, the scientific merchants of doubt ultimately, they failed, I guess. They overcome, their power waned. But the economics part, their power did not really wane in the same way. And, the implications are larger as well, because I looked at this economic consulting firm largely because I just stumbled upon their activities. But they were not alone. There were other consulting firms doing very similar work, but also their work is not that different from the work done at MIT, at the joint program where they do economic modeling there. That program is funded by the oil industry, not only the oil industry, but they do receive funding from the oil industry. These groups participated in something called the Energy Modeling Forum at Stanford University.
Oh, I remember you talking about this. It was like BP, Shell, Chevron, Exxon. I mean, all of them.
Absolutely. And that group is funded, almost entirely by fossil fuel interests. So there's the consulting part, then there's the academic environmental economics part, and the industry is involved with both in terms of their funding. And, I think at the end of the day, the question is, now, like, where does this leave us? Is the analysis wrong? First of all, is a good question to ask. Okay, what if it's actually right? Now, one of the nice things about this study was that one of these economists was willing to talk to me and, and honestly share his perspective and experiences. And we talked about the limitations of their models. And their models were essentially based on assumptions that have become mainstream in American economics, like the economy performs optimally without intervention and so on. These are unscientific concepts because they can't be tested, of course.
Right.
But it's just taken as an article of faith that if somebody has to do something that they're not already doing, it must be suboptimal. Right. And, it's a tautological, it's a circular reasoning type of logic. And, it's based on that. And then there are assumptions built into the model about how expensive clean energy is going to be. And it's assumed to be expensive, like forever, like really expensive, and things like that. So the way the model itself is constructed, it's not really like reliable in terms of what is this actually going to cost. So that part's not really quantitatively reliable. Then you have the other side, which is the benefit side, which is not even being addressed, right? So it's impossible to even make a comparison in terms of, is this policy worth it or not? And so, at the end of the day, the public has been sold this. I mean, it's a fraudulent economic product, right? You have economists saying, we did the analysis and it's too expensive. And it's now, even by their own admission, that's not true. So, and this has been going on for decades. So now the question is, what do we do about this?
Right.
You know, s-
Right.
yeah. And I think that's,
Well,
I
because
don't
it's so
know.
embedded. This is the thing that, like we were saying before, that it's not just the, you know, proposed solutions, it's the entire framing of the problem. It's like the soup that we're all swimming in. You know?
I thought,
But
yeah,
you see particularly the oil industry investing really, really heavily in making sure that no one can even think of an economy that doesn't work this way.
that's right. That's right. And you have, of course, students who are going to school to study economics, they're taught that this is the way the world works, that this is how
Yes.
economies work. And there's been some fascinating historical research done on the origins of neoclassical economics. And I think one of the most compelling, some of the best work has been done by Philip Murawski, who's a historian of economics. And, and he shows quite convincingly, I think, that neoclassical economics, when it was formed, the basic ideas of it was an imitation of what physics was at that time.
Mm.
And, physics was being seen as this pretty prestigious, like reliable science. It's highly mathematical, and economics wanted to sort of scientize itself. And so it literally took the equations from physics at the time, and it took the ideas, like ideas of spontaneous equilibrium, and it just said, this is how the economy works. It just sort of
Right.
asserted that. And
Right.
the sort of fatal flaw in that approach was that the physics version was at least testable. It was at least
Mhm.
falsifiable, and eventually it was. I
Right.
mean, new fields of physics were developed, like quantum physics, because of the failures of the older models to explain observations. Now, the
Right.
economics version was not based on observable variables that you can measure and test. It was simply an assertion of
Mm.
how the economy works, and no matter what you observe, you simply say, that's just a result of our theory, more or less. And so it's not something that you can test or prove or disprove. And so it's sort of persisted as more of an ideology, or a pseudoscience, more than an
Mhm.
actual scientific theory. And this would just be a curiosity in the history of science if it were not for its major impacts on public policy today, and obviously its
Yeah.
major impacts on climate change, because economists are invoking these theories
Yeah.
in saying, don't curtail fossil fuel use. Based on this model, it's going to be really expensive.
Right. In saying these are the only allowable solutions. Like
Mhm.
it just immediately narrows what can be done about this problem. Just
And it, like you said, it's not just the oil industry that benefits from these economic ideas. It's all
Mhm.
regulated industries, because embedded
Right.
within the self-optimizing market concept is the
Mhm.
implication that regulation by nature is expensive,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that you should more or less let things go, or at least you can't really go that wrong if you do. So all regulated industries have a sort of, a benefit to be gained from these economic theories. The theories themselves are biased against regulating, big industries.
I was looking at all of the different law and economic centers that the Olin Foundation has set up at every university. And, they were like big funders of climate denial too. But like John Olin was a chemicals guy, you know, and he
Mhm.
and he was like tired of regulation, and he was tired of, I think a lot of these guys saw the lawsuits in the 90s against the tobacco companies as like a serious threat to any industry. And they really set about creating conservative litigation infrastructure that would combat what they saw as like liberal public interest law. And it's always it's I don't know, in every single one of these places it's combined with economics and specifically teaching this sort of laissez-faire free market economics as, you know, an unquestionable truth. You know?
And you know, there's the whole economics part, but there's other interesting parts that I think we're on the verge of being aware of. You know, like in some of Exxon's internal documents from the 1980s and the late 1970s about climate change, Exxon says they need to do research on not just the physical impacts of climate change, but on psychology, mass psychology, and risk perception.
Right.
Risk perception among lay people, you know, just everyday, normal, regular people, but also among the policymakers and government officials. You know, how do you influence and control how people perceive this problem and how to respond to it? And you know, that's another area of social science that it appears at least that the oil industry was very interested in being expert at and potentially influencing. But I think we don't, you know, I certainly don't know yet what they did in that area. But I think it's bigger than just economics. You know, economics is sort of maybe the obvious one because it's used so much in public policy making.
Well, and it's just always used. When people are talking about climate action, it's, you know, we need a livable planet, and people have been getting better and better, right, about making it human focused. But I feel like the economics argument did that from the beginning, right? Where it's like, no, you can't do this because it'll make people poor or it'll cost people jobs, or, you know, like they were so on that from jump, versus the environmental movement, which was like, you know, really stuck on trees and polar bears for quite a while. Not that, hey, I have nothing against trees, but it is kind of hard to piece it all together.
It is. It's sprawling, and it's one of those topics that you only become aware of it if you're in a particular vantage point, and it's hard to get to that vantage point without being part of the issue, you know, without being sort of like, it's hard to know that the Kennedy School at Harvard is funded by oil unless you're a professor at the Kennedy School.
Right.
And at that point, you're not likely to point that out to the public, at least not without risking your career or some prospects. So it's one of these things. It's hard for people to become aware of it if they don't have already a vested interest in maintaining it the way it is. So I think finally that's beginning to change. And I don't want to, you know, criticize, and I don't mean to criticize all economists, because, you know, this is a particular approach that I'm talking about that unfortunately has become, that for at least for a long time was very dominant, right, in the United States at least, but it's a very diverse discipline. And I think now lately there are more and more economists who are doing really high quality work to look at, you know, how much does like sea level rise cost in terms of damage? You know, and you get a very different view of the cost of climate change if you use that bottom up approach rather than the sort of predetermined top down approach that was being used before. So it's also largely a matter of methodology, and this is beginning to change. And I think, you know, why is it important whether the industry is funding the work? Well, you know, now, like if the industry is not as dominant, then there is going to be that room for, you know, other economists to use different approaches.
Right.
And it's all a matter of what gets amplified and what doesn't.
I'm curious about that because I feel like with a lot of the kind of more obvious oil funding of research, them funding research into energy alternatives and things like that, that there is pretty clearly laid out. I mean, like actually Stanford even has had this on their website for the
Global Climate and Energy Project.
Yeah. They had like on their website sort of, here's how we select projects and here's who weighs in where. And I mean, they just straight up admitted that the funders had the final call on what would get funded for research. But I don't think that's the case with the economic stuff. And it's also just not as straightforward. So have you ever, from any of these things gotten any sense of how much fossil fuel companies are dictating, what they want? I guess if the API is commissioning a study from an economist, they're just straight up telling them what they want. But I wonder if it's that direct in university research.
Yeah, I think it varies. What I've seen is that it doesn't have to be that direct in order to have an effect. If you think about you have an entire field, let's say climate economics or environmental economics as a field. If you're an industry like the oil industry, you can send someone to all the environmental economics conferences around the country.
Right.
And monitor the research that people are doing. And there are certain paradigms and people, frankly, but if you think about their work in terms of a paradigm, what they're interested in, what they're not, there are certain paradigms that are helpful for the industry and others that are not, and or more or less, of course. And simply by funding certain things, you amplify that thing, and that takes up more space than it would have otherwise. And so the recipient doesn't necessarily have to be even aware, that they're getting this money for any sort of strategic reason on the part of the industry. And I think often the recipients either are unaware or they don't like the idea, so they kind of ignore it, the possibility. But, that's why in this new research, I open it with this quote from a handbook from 1978. And this is sort of, earlier on in the sort of modern regulatory state in the United States. A lot of regulatory policies being passed in the 70s. And so the big companies are trying to figure out, well, how do we respond to this new regime? And in this handbook written for regulated industries to basically game the system, it says one of our main recommendations is to co-opt the experts, and it says, this policy is made, with the participation of experts, especially academics. And it says a regulated firm or industry should be prepared whenever possible to co-opt these experts. This is most effectively done by identifying the leading experts in each relevant field and hiring them as consultants or advisors or giving them research grants and the like. It requires a modicum of finesse. It must not be too blatant, for the experts themselves must not recognize that they've lost their objectivity and freedom of action. And at a minimum, it reduces the threat that these experts will testify against the industry or write against the interests of the industry. So this was recognized as a major central pillar of all regulated industry strategy, counter-regulatory strategy, from very early on, from the 1970s. So, in the case of climate, I think what we see is that there are certain areas like, the fossil fuel industry really hates renewable portfolio standards. Because, maybe your guess is as good as mine, because I'm not like super expert on renewable portfolio standards, but my impression is that they're hard to game. It says you have to have this much renewables by this year.
Right.
It's very straightforward.
Right.
It seems that the oil industry would much rather have a cap and trade system that it can game, that it can get little concessions with. It can manipulate the price and make it crash or make it soar to like mess it up. There's lots of ways to kind of mess up a cap and trade system so that it just doesn't work right. And so I see environmental economists who are big, their whole career is based on cap and trade and doing paper after paper after paper about cap and trade systems and how to make it optimal and how to design it for this or that. They're getting funded by the oil industry. So that becomes the dominant paradigm through which people view environmental policy. Oh, cap and trade is default. Other things like renewable portfolio standard, that's alternative. That's not as good. That's what we think about second. That's what we talk about on the last day of class if we have time. But the main thing is cap and trade, even though there aren't really very many functional cap and trade systems in the world, so it's like you can influence the entire way people learn about the issue. Another great example is hydrogen versus electric vehicles. This is another thing I noticed when I was looking at industry funding was, a lot of oil funding for hydrogen future, for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and like none for electric battery vehicles. And I was like, this is sort of weird. I mean, do they just think that, hydrogen is better? And, well, I mean, obviously by this point, it's clear that at least now hydrogen, vehicles are not, competitive, at least currently. And what a lot of people don't realize is that almost all hydrogen is made out of natural gas. And so a lot of hydrogen, presumably would be either largely or significantly fossil fuel, just sort of in disguise. And, so it's these sort of options. It's, well, if we have to go to non-gas vehicles, we'd rather them be hydrogen than battery. It's better for us. And so through this selective funding, it's not that hard to shape the entire discussion. And of course, when someone's been receiving funding for their research for decades, that certainly shapes the way they think. It certainly shapes, where their allegiances are.
Right.
It's going to dissuade them from, writing against the industry or testifying against it. And, they're going to have connections within the industry. They're going to promote the industry with their students as a place to work. They're going to be getting grants. All of these things have an effect. So, yeah, I think, it doesn't have to be so blatant. It doesn't have to be, like a quid pro quo arrangement.
Yeah. I think about this with respect to media influence all the time too. Like people, I don't know, my current obsession on that front is the fact that Ted Boutros, who's like Chevron's attorney, works for every major media outlet. He's CNN's First Amendment attorney, but now he's also the New York Times First Amendment attorney and Reveal. And he sits on the board of ProPublica. And I'm like, yeah, like he's not doing that because he loves the media. I just think about, I'm like, well, we have a First Amendment attorney and I talk to him pretty regularly and I talk to him about all kinds of things and he shares his opinion as attorneys are wont to do. Like he's a smart guy who I pay a lot of money for his opinion. So like I listen to his opinion on lots of things, and the idea that like somehow Ted Boutros is just lurking around the hallways of every major media outlet in the country, but it has no influence on how anyone thinks of climate liability cases just seems really unlikely.
It does seem unlikely now that you mention it.
Unlikely, yes. I'm like, do people like? It's weird to me because I'm like, do you not know what the word influence means? Like, it's not a bribe. Like, it's subtle,
I know.
Anyway.
I mean, it is interesting. I know that's one of the oil companies' big defenses is their First Amendment defense.
Right.
But, unfortunately for them, I mean, you probably know, the First Amendment does not protect fraudulent communications.
Drilled is an original production of the Critical Frequency Podcast Network. This series is a collaboration with Earther, Gizmodo's climate and justice site. My co-host and co-reporter for the series is Darna Noor. Our editors are Julia Ritchie for Drilled and Brian Kahn for Earther. Our producer is Juliana Bradley. Mixing and mastering by Peter Duff. Our fact-checker is Trevor Gowan. Music is by Martin Wissenberg. Our artwork was created by Matthew Fleming. Our First Amendment attorney is James Wheaton of the First Amendment Project. You can find corresponding stories, videos, and documents for this series on earther.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.